As all of us know, Anup is Commerce Secretary Designate. So there's going to be a heavy responsibility on his shoulders dealing with various trade wars going on around the world. And we're just absolutely delighted that he has found the time to chair this session. So Anup, over to you. 20 minutes for the 30 minutes for the author, and 10 minutes each for the discussants. Thank you.
Thank you, Shekhar. My thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and I'm, of course, delighted to be here and to chair this session. I think the subject of the paper is extremely topical and very relevant in terms of its policy implications. Indian exports, since the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, have shown a lot of volatility. It's a somewhat confusing and unclear trend. I think initially, when the global financial crisis hit us, there was a steep decline. But then I think we recovered wonderfully well. And then our exports in value terms, based on DGCI's data from shipping bills, in value terms, exports peaked at $314 billion in 2013-14. And then, of course, the global financial crisis in some ways intensified. The real economies got affected in a pronounced manner. Countries like China got impacted for the first time in a pronounced manner. And that again affected our exports, and there were 2 years of fairly steep declines. Then last 2 years, 16, 17, 17, 18, again, our exports have shown a recovery thanks to, I think, environmental factors and various, policy initiatives that were taken. So we've seen 2 years of recovery, and even this financial year, there's a growth of around, between 15 to 20% in this financial year also. So the last 2 financial years, this financial year, it's an encouraging story. Although we still haven't reached the peak of 13-14 is still unattained. So I think given this complexity, given these somewhat fluctuating movements, the paper is very timely and topical. You see, as we all know, exports have many determinants, so it's a very complex area to model, a complex variable to explain. You have various supply-side variables which are related to your domestic competitiveness, your domestic supply-side environment. These are to some extent, policy variables which are in your control. Then you, of course, have supply-side variables which are from outside the border, supply-side impacts like, oil prices, which are largely out of your control, so they don't have much direct policy implication, or they don't have any relevance in terms of shaping that environment by the policy maker. Then you have various demand-side variables affecting your exports, which include, the income and price elasticities which our exports experience globally. That has something to do with the sophistication of your export basket, the nature of your export basket, how resilient are your products to global sort of downturns and sort of buoyant periods of growth. And to that extent, I think our exports, some sectors like gems and jewelry, leather goods, which are major items of export, do face that issue of not being very resilient to global recessions. So the determinants of exports are many, and the modeling is accordingly quite complex. But I think the paper has done a wonderful job in terms of capturing the key determinants. Of course, I'm not an econometrician. It is for the econometricians amongst us to see how, adequately modeled the entire exercises. And there were some issues I saw at a first glance. One is the issue of data. Typically, we look at exports in dollar terms, dollar value terms from the shipping bill data compiled by DGCIS. I think the paper uses real export performance from GDP data. So there's an issue of, the deflator that is getting used as part of GDP statistics, whether the real data coming out of GDP statistics is the relevant data to see, or we need to cross-check and validate with the DGCIS data. Another issue which struck me was whether we could model the behavior of Indian exports relative to, global export performance, maybe model the variable related to the share of Indian exports in world exports and see, because then that factors out the common global effects which impacted the world as a whole. Maybe that the authors could explain as to whether there is any utility in doing that. And of course, as we will see, the results are very intuitive. Let me not say more and come between this very distinguished audience and the very distinguished panelists. So let me invite the authors to make I think you have the CVs for all the participants, so I will not spend time on that, on the introductions, but let me just quickly invite the authors to make their presentation. And I think 30 minutes is the time prescribed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wadhawan, for those very useful comments. Let me start by thanking IPF. It's a delight to be here, and to the editors, Shekhar and Karthik, for having me here. Wonderful to be here. Time is short, so and there's a lot to say. So let me jump into what the paper is about, right? So we've been, and I think several references in the last 24 hours on this macro puzzle about why have India's exports slowed so precipitously in the last few years. And it's come up in trying to explain the GDP growth slowdown. The puzzle is twofold. One is, why have we experienced this prolonged sluggishness since 2012, as I will show? And number two, on the way up, even as 2017 saw the strongest global growth in 7 years, why haven't our exports responded in tandem? And hopefully, to Mr. Wadhawan's very useful comments, I will try and prove that as well. So to try and answer that puzzle, the paper has sort of three distinct questions. One is the question of modeling what are the determinants of India's exports, which is clearly non-trivial given the endogeneity and all of these variables. So we look and try to estimate what the income and price elasticities are, and then control for a bunch of other regressors that Mr. Wadhawan referred to. Second is, once we have these estimates, how heterogeneous are these, right? Because India's export basket is very dynamic. How have these changed across time? How do these change across sectors? And then to try and take a stab, and it's a stab at first pass, it's a first, can we use the model to kind of rationalize the slowdown in the last few years, particularly because there are so many proximate factors that we speak about, right? We've had deglobalization and the fact that global growth has come down. I will make the case that India's trade-weighted real effective exchange rate has appreciated. We've seen rising trade protectionism, and you've seen some transient domestic adverse supply shock. So many different factors can explain this, and I think the job is to try and disentangle which of these factors matters and which doesn't. Through this entire process, something that we began in 2010 but hasn't fully caught on is try and instill a greater appreciation for why exports and trade more generally is important in this economy. Place after place I go, there's still a sense that India, is largely a domestic-driven economy. Trade matters only at the margin, and I'm going to try and make the case that both the growth surge of the 2000s and the slowdown of the last few years can be explained almost entirely by the behavior of exports. So without further ado, this is just some housekeeping. Let's just stipulate on the fact that there is, I think, much greater integration on the capital side. Every day we talk about portfolio inflows and outflows, and the sudden stop that India was afflicted by in 2011 and 2013 and earlier this year, but not enough appreciation for the integration on the real economy side, right? And it's just important to point out that between 2000 and 2012, exports to GDP, doubled. They went from 12% of GDP to 25. Now I will talk about the fact that one needs to be careful here and talk about the domestic value-added component, which is an important distinction to make, and I'll refer to that. But gross exports to GDP doubled in 12 years. And for those of us who still think we're a very closed economy, these are the levels of exports to GDP that prevail in Indonesia. And no one claims Indonesia is a particularly closed economy. And then you've got the slump. The right-hand side chart, I think, is kind of more important. If you just stop or draw a vertical line somewhere in 2012, it's important that consumption to GDP is still the largest part on the expenditure side. But look at the trajectories here. That consumption to GDP has been fell for the most part between 2000 and 2012. And really what powered growth was investment and exports. And the reason I say this is if you stop this line in 2012, this is very much what China looked like for 20 years, where you had exports to GDP rising, that was pulling along investment to GDP, and consumption was slowly falling. Now, interestingly, these growth drivers have changed in the last 3-4 years. Investment has come down, we've spoken about that. Exports to GDP have come down, and consumption has done some of the heavy lifting. Yes? So this is everything, goods and services. And I'll make that distinction from place to place. So if we now look at the period of 2003 to 8, the big growth spurt that we speak about, where growth was 8.8%, it's important to realize a lot of that was driven by external demand. Right? In real terms, exports in those 5 years, admittedly of a low base, grew at almost 18% a year for 5 successive years. Now, we need to be careful to look at the domestic value-added component. There's an excellent paper by IGIDR last year that teases out, using input-output tables, the domestic value component. If you look at that growth rate, that has been almost 17%. Consumption, in comparison, only grew at 7%. So I will make the case, and again, this is just an observation, that the big investment surge we had in the mid-2000s was not unrelated to what was happening on the export side, right? Investment is endogenous. You required some demand impulse. That demand impulse, I would argue, came from foreigners buying, right? From external demand growing at 16% a year in real terms, or 17% a year for 5 successive years. And really, investment was servicing exports more than domestic consumption. And therefore, some part of the investment slowdown in the last few years is also attributable, in my mind, to the pronounced slowdown in external demand and exports. Just a few kind of nuances here. If you look at India's export basket, take oil out of it, right? What you find is there have been 2 kind of revolutions at the top-down macro level. One we understand well, one is underappreciated. The first is this big increase in services, right? So services as part of the export basket goes from about 28% in 2000, touches almost 40% in 2008, and then gradually tapers off before re-accelerating slowly. Manufacturing makes way for that and comes down. So that part we all know and appreciate. The part that's less understood, I think, or less appreciated, and Mr. Wadhawan touched to this, is there's been a very dynamic change in the manufacturing non-oil export basket. India's traditional exports, leather, textiles, gems and jewelry, are a much smaller fraction of that manufacturing basket. Really, in the last 10 years, you've seen engineering goods, pharmaceuticals, auto parts, capital goods, right, become the vast majority. They're now 60% of our non-oil manufacturing basket. And it's important to make this distinction because, as I'll show later, these elasticities across income and price are very heterogeneous and very much a function of the sector. So that was the first part, right? That you had this 2000 surge, exports were a big driver of India's growth performance. The export basket was changing quite dynamically. Then you get the second part of the story, which is that export growth has slowed and slowed precipitously. We actually use 2 definitions of exports here to answer Mr. Wadhawan's question. One is from the GDP data because that's the most far-reaching historically, but we also use the equivalent of what Mr. Wadhawan said, which is we deflate merchandise exports using an IMF deflator, which is very close to DGCIS. We deflate service exports and we add those up. So all the regressions are done using both, and I'll show you the results really don't change. This is exports data from GDP, real exports data. You had this 12-year period where exports were growing on average at 15% a year. And now the last 6 years, it's been growing at 4% a year, right? You see in the last 15 years, every peak has been lower than the previous peak in terms of exports. So yes, there's been some recovery the last 8 quarters, but we're a far cry away from where we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago, at a time when global growth recovered quite smartly in 2017. This is across the, manufacturing and services, so the slowdown is not concentrated in any one sector, it's pretty broad-based. And I'm going to make the case that, the entire GDP slowdown in the last 5 years compared to the 5 years of the mid-2000s can be explained mechanically by exports. Right? Growth was averaging 8.8% between 2003 and 8. In the last 5 years, it's averaged 6.9%. This is a new and old series. So there's been about 195 basis point slowdown in GDP growth. Now let's look at the value add of exports. They were growing at 17% a year in the mid-2000s. They're growing at 3.5% a year the last 5 years. Admittedly, the value added domestic value add of exports has been progressively coming down. Now, this is an important distinction to make. This is, I think, work for the future because, I think Professor Dixit referred to this yesterday, where the import content is going up in part because India is gradually integrating into some value chains. I would argue this is also an endogenous decision and would, for example, be affected by the trajectory of the real effective exchange rate. So India, in a sense, has got a double whammy, that gross export growth rates are much lower than 10 years ago, and the domestic value add of that is actually coming down. Now, that's not a bad thing, but typically what you find is when domestic value add comes down and you integrate more into global value chains, that per unit impact is more than offset by the scale of being in a value chain. India has suffered the per unit impact, where imports are a larger fraction of our exports without getting the scalability. And so from a contribution to growth perspective, this is a double whammy. Right, that you've seen much lower gross export growth rates the last 5 years compared to 10 years ago, and the domestic value add is coming down. So if I simply do the arithmetic, right, what is the share of value add in GDP? What is the growth rate now? What's your contribution to GDP today versus what it was? It's the entire thing. It's 205 basis points. Right? Now, this is undoubtedly a mechanical exercise, and as Dr. Joshi so rightly said, you can mechanically use investment to explain part of the slowdown as well. But again, I would argue investment is endogenous to some demand impulse, and this really is the demand impulse. So exports matter. They matter both because they kind of were driver on growth on the upside and on the downside. I know I've got a lot to cover, so let me just say there has been some underperformance here. I'm sure Surjit might disagree. There has been some underperformance here. If I look at global growth versus India's exports here, the recovery has been much less convincing based on global growth. One can argue that's really not valid because the whole deglobalization thesis is that global exports are less sensitive to global growth. So really what I want to normalize by is global exports. If you look at global exports, you've seen that the pickup there suggests, again, prima facie, there's been some undershooting. Perhaps the easiest way to do this for me is let's take a sufficiently long time period. World export growth, this is merchandise, so this is merchandise because we have this data more, was growing at 4% between 2004 and 11, is growing at 2.4% the last 6 years. There's been about a 40% decline. In India's case, in the same period, merchandise, real exports, growing at almost 9% back then, growing at 1.3% the last 6 years. So there's clearly, by most measures, an underperformance. Right? The flip side of this is we haven't seen the pickup in the last year. FY17 to FY18 saw the strongest global growth, as I said, the biggest pickup in 7 years. Global growth went from 2.7% to 3.4%. India's manufacturing basket deflated, grew at 5.4% the year before in those 4 quarters of FY17, grown at 5.7%. So at a time where global growth rates went up by 25%, India's manufacturing exports, which are typically very elastic, right, have only increased by 5%. So all of this is just to set the stage that there is a puzzle here. There is a problem here. Exports have underperformed, and so what's driving that? This then takes me to the heart of the paper, which is what are these income and price elasticities, how heterogeneous are they, and how do we make sense of the export slump? One motivation is I was really surprised when we started this work of how little literature there is using macro data on this very important question. I can count on the fingers of one hand how many India-specific studies there are trying to understand the determinants, an important question, of India's exports. Raisi and Tulin, the most recent work from the IMF, but their data stops in 2013, so nothing for the last 5 years. Rakesh Mohan, Manish Kapoor have an important paper. That's a 2014 paper using data that stops in 2008. Jahangir and I had a paper back in 2012 that stopped in 2008. So really for the last 10 years, especially during the slowdown, we really haven't had any kind of rigorous empirical evidence telling us what drives India's exports and what explains the slowdown. Now, of the existing literature there's more or less conformity on the income elasticity. Everybody finds a reasonably healthy income elasticity. Global growth or global exports picks up by 1%. India's exports respond typically strongly, and I'll show that again. Where there's a lot of variety, disparity in conclusion, in decision, is on price elasticities. And this spans the spectrum. From some papers that find no elasticity of India's exchange rate, to those that find very small elasticities on the impact of the exchange rate, to Rakesh Mohan's paper, which is a decade old, which finds a large elasticity, or Tulin's paper that finds a reasonably large elasticity. There's a big diversity here, right? So that really is the motivation, a very sparse literature, no real conformity on the impact of the effective exchange rate, and it's very dated. So what do? We use the kind of standard log linear model, which has been kind of the dominant and empirically successful method to do this around the world in other countries, where we're simply going to say that on my left-hand side is real exports, and I'll define that in many different ways. I can use real exports from GDP. I can use real exports from using DGCI's data, and I will try and explain that through a number of variables. Predominantly, it's global impulses, so this could be global GDP, it could be global exports. There will be a price variable there, which in our case is the 36-country trade-weighted real effective exchange rate, right? The broadest measure of competitiveness. We will use that, two different varieties of that. There's the version that the Reserve Bank of India puts out. There's a version that the BIS puts out. We use both. Those are our primary variables, and then there are a whole bunch of controls. We add the commodity price index for fear of the fact that the deflators haven't fully deflated out commodity price changes, which have been sharp and acute in the last 10 years. Tulin's paper finds some evidence of supply bottlenecks. They use a very narrow version of that. They say electricity shortages, which in the last few years have not become a binding constraint. So we use a broader definition of supply bottlenecks by looking at the number of stalled projects, which is a proxy for implementation bottlenecks on the ground. We have a dummy for the global financial crisis, and because Surjit's my discussant, I also put in the real interest rate. You can control for many variables. Now, the key here is the estimation, and I think that's where the results in the past matter. All of these variables are non-stationary, so we need to be very careful how we estimate this stuff, right? So you can do all these unit root tests and find that these things are non-stationary, but importantly, they're all co-integrated. They're all co-integrated in a variety of tests. What that tells me is these have stable, long-term equilibrium relationships. And it's that information that we have to exploit, right? What we use two estimation techniques. One is a dynamic OLS, which is the most kind of efficient manner when you've got relatively small samples, where you're using leads and lags of the differences in variables to take care of the autocorrelation as well as the endogeneity. As a robustness check, we will use the vector error correction mechanism, which is also quite standard. The advantage of that is I can estimate these long-run elasticities, but also have a lambda, which tells me the pace of adjustment from the disequilibrium to the equilibrium. That's really sets the stage for future work. So the key is these are long-run elasticities. And I think one thing that the literature has taught us is if you use short-run by using differences, you get much lower elasticities because as we'd expect, right, exports don't respond to exchange rates, for example, contemporaneously in that quarter or the next quarter, given all the rigidities and menu costs. But over long periods of time, movements in the real effective exchange rate change the relative attractiveness of producing for the tradable versus the non-tradable sector, and therefore you pick up these things really in the long run. We cannot use standard OLS over here when you've got non-stationary variables. So what do we find? Our baseline results, our first dependent variable is the deflated one using the IMF deflator, so it's not the GDP export data. And the standard result is then global growth, that every 1% change in global growth or global exports will push up India's real exports by about 2.6%. The first column is the baseline result. And importantly, we find a large elasticity on the real effective exchange rate. That every 1% appreciation of the real effective exchange rate trade weighted in the long term will hurt exports by 1.4%, right? That's our basic finding. Now, we've got a bunch of robustness tests. We add a dummy for the global financial crisis. We've got the CRB, the commodity price variable. We add stall projects. We add real rates for cost of capital at home, and the fundamental result holds up under all of these robustness checks. The magnitudes will change, so we just drop what's not significant and we stick to our kind of original specification, which is the kind of least incumbent. We repeat all of this for using a different dependent variable. Now we use export data from GDP, right, just to make sure that these results are not a function of the way we've deflated these variables, and the results are even more convincing. The coefficients change a little bit, but you get the same result, right? That these are relatively large price elasticities. I think the most recent work of the IMF had found this to be 1, so we find this to be 1.4%, which is not that different from what Rakesh Mohan had found 10 years ago. And the global growth elasticities are large. So the first finding is, in the long run, over the last 13 years, our data starts in 2004 and goes up until 2017, you find large partner country income and price elasticities. We then do another robustness check. We use a Weckham model. This again holds up. The coefficients keep changing, but the basic result does not change. Right? Now, one can say, well, you're using these levels. Why don't you make these variables stationary by just using it in differences? So we'll do that as well. This is kind of anticipating some comments. So we difference the variables. Once I difference the variables, they become stationary. I can then use standard OLS techniques. We run this in differences, not levels. You get the same result. Now, the key here is when I'm running it in differences, this really is picking up short-term changes. And so the minus 0.9, which is the coefficient on the price elasticity, is expectedly lower and smaller in the short run. It's lower than the long run elasticity, which is a finding that other papers have made as well. That said, I still think there are problems with this estimation technique because there's a lot of endogeneity in these variables. So if I really need to use a vector autoregression over here, but if I use a VAR, there is a misspecification error. So this is more a robustness check. I think the co-integration technique is more kosher. So that was the first part. Now the second part is, how have these elasticities changed over time? And what you find is both the income and the price elasticity have attenuated over time. Right? So we break our sample up between 2005 to 11 and 2011 to 17. What you find is in the first subsample, income elasticities were 3%. They've come down to 2.4. This is a very standard finding across multiple countries. This is the deglobalization hypothesis, right? And in fact, the IMF's done some very good work on this, saying that 3/4 of this attenuation for most countries can be explained by the changing composition of growth. That until 2016, even as global growth was holding up post-crisis, the composition of that growth had changed away from investment into consumption. And as a consequence of that, these typical linkages from developed market growth to emerging market exports had broken down. Right? And so it's really the lower investment both in the developed markets and the commodity exporters that got hit very badly once commodity prices fell. So those are easy to understand. What we find is even these price elasticities have actually come down. In the first subsample, they're about 1.9%. In the last 6 years, they've come down to 1.1%. This, to me, prima facie may require more work, but is not surprising given the earlier chart that I showed you, which is that the domestic value add of gross exports is coming down. Right? So some other work using firm level data has found this, that the lower the domestic value add of exports, the less exchange rate should matter. In the limit, if I'm importing 95% of what I re-export, if the exchange rate doesn't matter, the more value add I have, the more I should be sensitive to the exchange rate. I would simply counter that by saying this itself is an endogenous choice and maybe a function of the trade-weighted exchange rate. So there are two effects here. Do trade-weighted exchange rates affect the choice to import versus produce domestically? And having resulted in some choice, what then is the impact on final goods exports? But that's kind of the intuition behind why we find these elasticities to be lower in the last 6 years. The other part then is to look at this cross-sectionally and to say that if we look across sectors, what do we see in terms of income and price elasticities? What you find is India's new age exports, right? Pharmaceuticals, engineering goods, services have much larger partner country elasticities than the older exports of textile, leather, gems and jewelry. So in some sense, the older exports are more sluggish to global impulses and so more invariant to changes in the business cycle. The new exports are much more sensitive, do very well in the good times and fall off in the bad times, suggesting there's a more discretionary component to these new age exports. And we kind of get the same result on prices as well, that these price elasticities are larger for the newer exports than they are for the older exports. We then, as a kind of a final check, do the same decomposition of these sectors across these two time periods, just to confirm that the slowdown is not being concentrated in one or two sectors and is quite broad-based, and you find more or less the same thing. Now, I will have a big caveat here. Remember what I said earlier, we're using dynamic OLS and vacuums. Now, one criticism could be, these are very short samples to make these conclusions. So admittedly, one shortcoming here is when I've got a 6-year sample, I'm using quarterly data, there will be some instability of these coefficients if I use this approach. But with that caveat notwithstanding, the directional result holds, where you find that across most of these sectors in the first 6-year period, 2005 to 11, income elasticities are larger than in the last 6 years, and for the most part, they're true of price elasticities. This then brings us to the third question, right? So we've said that basically exchange rates matter for exports, global growth matters, but both of these have come down over time. Number two, it matters differently for different sectors. And the third question then is, can we explain this slump in exports in the last 6 years? And we go about this in a very mechanical manner to say, let us stop our model in 2014, because we need a long enough sample, and let us over the last 3 years use the model's out of sample predictions and then compare that to what the actual realization of exports was to see how good a predictive power this model has out of sample. And if you do that, what you find is you can explain a large part of the slowdown, right? Now, so depending on where you stop the sample, but if you stop in 2014, average export growth rate has been about 8.6%. It used to be 15. It came down. It averaged 8.6%. The last 3 years, it's averaged 1.1%. And what the model would predict is about 3.5%, well, at least the baseline model, the dynamic OLS model. Vacuum is a little higher number. So I would argue this is not such a surprise. If you just look at traditional income and price elasticities in the last few years, we would have said ex ante that export growth in the last 3 years should have averaged about 3.5% in real terms. What we've seen is about 1.5%, and maybe the delta is because you've had these idiosyncratic but hopefully transient supply shocks through demonetization and GST, and maybe that explains some part of the residual. So part of this, however, the model's lower prediction has to do with a pretty meaningful drag from the real effective exchange. It basically pulls down export growth rates by 5 or 6 percentage points in the last 3 years, right? If I decompose why the drag. And that then brings me to the first implication. that is part of the slowdown in exports in the last 4 years, attributable not just to slower global growth and this deglobalization, but is also attributable to the fact that India has had a sustained real effective exchange rate appreciation between 2014 and 2017. Now, depending on where you start this, but if you say by 2014, things had stabilized after the taper tantrum crisis, right? Between 2014 and 2017, India had a 20% trade-weighted real appreciation in those 3 years. And in our model, that has had an important impact in predicting much lower export growth rates. Now, not for a moment am I going to blame this on policy, because we wrote about this recently, that I think this is at some level an inevitable outcome of the Dutch disease that India went through. And in our view, the Dutch disease is India got a very large windfall from lower oil prices. Our estimates are in 2015 and 2016, the windfall to the economy was, the terms of trade shock was about 3% of GDP. Our estimates are 2/3 of that got spent. Half went to the public sector, which got spent. 40% went to households, much of that got spent. So, there was a 2% of GDP boost to GDP from lower oil prices, and economic theory would suggest that, that would push up the trade-weighted real exchange rate in equilibrium. Now, Dr. Joshi made a very good point that I'm glibly using interchangeably the external real effective exchange rate and the internal real effective exchange rate, which is the price of tradables to non-tradables. But I would argue that when you have a positive terms of trade shock, these things directionally go in the same manner, in the same way, because as I will show you later, the external equivalent of this was much lower current account deficits, which meant for any capital flow, the balance of payment surplus is much higher, putting upward pressure on the nominal and the real effective exchange rate. So the first kind of implication here is that exchange rates matter. They've probably had an impact on exports the last 4 years. Part of it is because you've seen this very sharp real appreciation, which in my view is an upshot of the oil windfall, suggesting some sort of Dutch disease. Now we can broaden this argument as I wrap up here. We can broaden the argument. I was quite stunned to realize that we've spoken about the impact on the export side, but if you look at the current account more generally, and let's take oil and gold out, and let's look at the current account as a percent of GDP. If I take oil imports out and gold imports out, we run a current account surplus. Right? But look at how that surplus has deteriorated in the last 3 years. On the left-hand side chart, the current account surplus in 2014, remember ex-oil and gold, was about 5.5% of GDP. By 2017, it had come down to 2.5% of GDP. 3 percentage points in 3 years. Right? The right-hand side chart overlays on that same current account dynamic the real effective exchange rate, but I'm inversing the scale. So now when the yellow line actually comes down, that's a real appreciation. Now I'm not attributing causality here, but it's just striking how strong the correlation is, that precisely in those 3 years that the trade-weighted exchange rate appreciated so much, you've had the underlying current account widen so much, right? So clearly this calls out for more work on the import side, because we've only shown it to matter on the export side, but perhaps the implications are larger. I'll just wrap up here. The day-to-day implications are real, because we're all going through a period of time where the currency is under some pressure, and people are wondering what the right policy implication is. Too many numbers on this chart, so I just want to make the point that part of the problem with the underlying current account widening so much or deteriorating so much is you become very hostage to small changes or changes in oil prices, for example. So if oil prices average $75 a barrel this fiscal year, the current account deficit, I would just focus on the top 2 lines, which was $15 billion 2 years ago and tripled to almost $50 billion last year, despite growth slowing, will increase or will average about $80 billion in FY19, 2018-19. So we've gone from 0.7% of GDP 2 years ago to almost 2% of GDP last year to close to 3% of GDP. Part of this is oil prices going up, but part of this is simply a reflection of what that does when overlaid on the deterioration of the underlying current account deficit. Why is this an issue? Because FDI flows have clearly gone up. They almost doubled. They've gone from $20 billion in absolute terms to about 30 or 35. but you've got a current account deficit of $80 billion and FDI flows of 30 or 35, where is the remaining 45 billion going to come from? Is, I guess, the policy challenge of the day, especially because you've actually seen almost $10 billion of portfolio outflows the first 3 months. So in our estimates here, what we're assuming is even if those outflows are reversed and portfolio flows for the full year are zero but not negative, we could be staring at a $20 or $25 billion BOP deficit, right? So that's why this has such real-time functional implication. So let me end by saying what are the policy implications of all this. I would argue in the short run there are 3, and then 2 more important ones in the long run. One is that, let's not fight beyond the point this rupee depreciation. It is an equilibrium response to the fact that the terms of trade shock are now reversing. So you've got this big windfall from oil, the real effective exchange rate and equilibrium would appreciate. That's what economic theory would suggest. Now oil prices have moved back from 45 to 80 for the same reasons, a symmetrically converse manner. The equilibrium real effective exchange rate should now begin to depreciate. We should not fight that depreciation. By all means, we should slow down the pace of that depreciation so that you don't get into self-fulfilling capital outflows and panic. But I think it won't be prudent to protect levels. So number one, let the trade-weighted real effective exchange rate gradually depreciate because it's offsetting the appreciation of the last 3 years. Number two, there will be inflationary implications. Prachi Mishra and I did a paper 3 years ago where we found for every 1% USD INR depreciation, the impact on headline CPI is not trivial at 6 to 8 basis points. So there will be inflationary implications. It could affect inflation expectations. I think that should be handled through the monetary policy framework and possibly higher interest rates. The equilibrium response around the world in emerging markets the last 3 months has been hit with this global shock. We need higher rates and a weaker currency. So India may not be able to escape that equilibrium response. And I think the other implication is fiscal policy needs to be very careful in this environment and not to slip because, I've not gone into the determinants of the equilibrium real effective exchange rate. Capital flows matter, terms of trade matters, fiscal policy matters. So if you get fiscal slippage or expansionary fiscal policy this year, that will simply interfere and offset with the natural depreciation that will occur on the terms of trade shock. So far, policymakers need to be commended, my second last slide, for doing exactly that. There's a lot of focus on the exchange rate the last 2 months and 68. And firstly, I think these bilateral comparisons are just meaningless at this point in time. What matters is the trade-weighted real effective exchange rate, not what the dollar is doing against the rupee, because the dollar at the same time may well be strengthening or weakening against a whole host of currencies. But what none of us noticed was in the first few months of the year, before the panic for emerging markets started, we have begun to experience this. There's been a 6.5% trade-weighted real depreciation in the first 5 months of 2018, which I think is warranted, and I think is the right policy choice, that we've not stopped that from happening. What we have seen in the last 2 months, ever since the EM stress began, is the central bank and policymakers have been ensuring that the rupee is kind of in the center of the pack, so as to not unnerve anybody. Last thing then, medium-term implications are more important. I've just described the short-term stuff. India needs to dramatically improve underlying competitiveness on the export side, on the import side, quite apart from any FX depreciation. I think this requires not another paper, but another conference on, on infrastructure, global value chains, labor productivity. I'm not saying anything new here. That's the first medium-term implication. To reverse that chart that I showed you, which, haunts me still, of the underlying current account, both on the export side and the import side, worsening to its lowest level in more than 15 years. And the second, larger issues, we have to look for new growth drivers. The point I was making was, the 9% growth was driven entirely by exports and the hyper-globalization of the mid-2000s, which is a thing of the past. Because global growth, potential global growth is coming down, protectionism is going up. So we may never experience those 15% real export growth rates for 5-6 years, which means if you have to accelerate growth from 7 to 8 or 9, where will that delta come from, which I think also requires a policy confidence. My last slide, just conclusions. Exports are instrumental both in the surge and the slowdown. The export basket has witnessed 2 revolutions, one well acknowledged, one more hidden. Both global demand and the exchange rate are significant determinants of India's exports. I think that's that's an important finding. These elasticities have reduced over time and are very different across sectors. And slowing global growth and the real effective exchange rate appreciation can explain a bulk or a major part of the export slowdown. There's a lot of next work for future work. We need more firm level data to corroborate these top-down results. We have to dig much deeper into the domestic value-add content across sectors, and also the fact that that DVA itself is an endogenous response to many things, including the exchange rate, and then perhaps extend this approach to the import side as well. But thank you for letting me run it over, and very much look forward to the discussants' comments.
Well, thank you so much. My compliments to the authors for a very elegant paper. It's simple yet, analytically complete and sound. The results are quite intuitive, and I think the policy messages are very useful. So my compliments to them. Let me now quickly invite. I think we are slightly beyond time, but you were well within time, within the margin of error that is allowed. Let me now request the discussants. Dr. Bhalla first.
Yeah. This yours. Yeah. It's with great nervousness that I present my comments. Because around me and all my friends who I think completely agree with the results reached by Sajjid, and I reached somewhat different results, which I'll try and show. So you can understand, this is a debate I've had with him, with Shankar, with everybody around for a long, long time. So it's not now. So, with that caveat, let me continue. The paper is very, very rich, and one shouldn't expect less from Sajjid, and one didn't get less. So this is a rich paper, a whole bunch of stuff in there, very intuitive, and very convincing. What I will concentrate on is, as what the title suggests, is on his contention about the changes in trade shares, export shares, being affected by the real effective exchange rate. I think, as I mentioned yesterday, and I have a couple of slides on that, the world has gone through a mega transformation, especially since the global financial crisis, though I think it started before that. In terms of price deflators, and a lot of the stuff that we see could be a function that we think is a puzzle, can be explained by a deeper examination of the price deflators involved. And finally, after discussing this, I will get to what Mr. Wadhawan asked as to how does India compare with the rest of the world in terms who are being affected by the same phenomena as India has. So with that, let me go forward. So what the two major claims in the paper with regard to the narrow point that exports, they ask, why have Indian exports slumped in recent years and failed to materially respond to accelerating global growth over the last year? Now, I think the richness of the paper means, it doesn't really mean in over the last year. You mean slightly longer term, but I will even address that. And secondly, he says, our model can explain a significant slowing of exports in recent years, thereby confirming both global demand and exchange rate dynamics have posed meaningful headwinds towards exports in recent years, rather than the presumed temporary factors such as demonetization and GST. So I will try and address both of these. Their model is a very straightforward one. It's a function of prices. proxied by the real exchange rate, and global GDP and or trade growth. No problems with specification, except is the definition of the real effective exchange rate, which does not control for Balassa-Samuelson effects, which are productivity effects, and I think that makes a difference, especially his presentation, a lot of the stuff in the paper has to do with the golden era of 2003 to 2007, when exports went up in double-digit terms, and the rather bronze era of the last 4 or 5 years, when exports have slowed down to 3% or 4%, whatever they get. So now, the reason I'm emphasizing the overall, the incorporation of real effects of the productivity effects is that during the time period, 2003, 4, 7, the golden era, the Indian rupee was a lot more undervalued, and it is a lot less undervalued today than before, and that can explain part of the difference. But as I will try and show, really, even the earlier period doesn't quite stand up to scrutiny as having been that glorious a period in terms of export growth. Okay. Now, one severe problem I have, and that I think helps in understanding my comments, the using quarterly data for which are something really longer term data can lead to very confounding results and surprising results, one of which is the price elasticity that he found, and then you go further. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this, because there was a recent paper by the RBI which contended, based on quarterly data from 2005-06 onwards till 2016, and saying that, listen, a fiscal deficit increase, a consolidated fiscal deficit increase of 100 basis points will lead to inflation rising by 50 basis points. And in a detailed note, which is available and which I've written about, it turned out that they used data from 2005 onwards, and if you were to use their very same data from 2004 onwards, their significance goes away, and if you were to go earlier, their significance would go away even more. So just the addition of four quarters would change the entire story. You have the data for the BIS, and the BIS actually gives you larger elasticities. So it's very easy to go back to 1996, for which all quarterly data are available. So that's at a minimum what you should, but I think even then, the small sample size, I know Stock and Watson, et cetera, we have, as everybody in the room knows, there are thousands of small sample size tests. Now we have got dynamic ordinary least squares. I had to get Stata to download it very quickly. But I think, in one sense, I am very old-fashioned. There's a lot that can be learned from just annual data before going into the complications, the econometric complications and that's what I'll try and show. Fragile, very, very fragile quarterly data stuff. And one of the reasons for the fragility, I didn't have the full specification, which you now have, which was not there in the paper that I got. But, I get I have a real problem with the time period and the specification that I had before of obtaining a negative elasticity for RER. I get a positive elasticity of RER with exports growth. Exactly the same non-oil exports, but I only had global growth, for which I did have, I obtained the same results. And, maybe that the fact that I get a negative elasticity for RER is confirmed by the data that I will now show, that there is a reason why you may be getting just the opposite, why I'm getting the opposite result, that I get a positive elasticity between RER and exports growth. Okay. So now let's now get to the importance of deflators. Look at this. This was talked about yesterday. It's implicit in the talk, in the paper that Sajjid presents. You know, investments as a share of GDP declines from something like 38% to something like 31%. But if you really look at real investments and real GDP, this is again CSO data, you find that the decline is only about 4 to 5 percentage points, and 1 percentage point is already there. So are we really talking about something going from 34, 35 to 31, and that's causing the entire slump in growth, et cetera? I think we need to worry about that result. Then, you know, what do I find? I find that the Indian exports have performed really well, just completely contrary to the very convincing, seemingly convincing results that Sajjid presents. And this is just a quote from their paper, which he just presented. Let me just show you the evidence. Okay, this is the trends in Indian goods and services exports as a percent of our GDP. And notice, the RER very correctly goes up, and what you have is that trade in goods and services, if you add the two together, it peaked at something like 17% and came down over here. And clearly the right-hand side completely confirms what he's saying. What is not quite apparent over here is that between, one second, let me just go back, that between 2000 and 2007, when we had the largest increase in our trade shares, was also a 10 percentage point increase in the real effective exchange rate. Let me just come to that table. And this is where, here we are. Look at non-oil export growths, and RER 36 goes from something like 102 to 108 during the time period. And if you have the BIS one, goes from 90 to 102. This is the boom time of Indian exports. You got 11 percentage point increase in the RER, and you get a boom in Indian exports. So I would be very, very worried, but there's more to come. And let's just look at this slide. I just want to show what's happened to world manufacturing deflator. The price deflator for that hasn't moved at all. This is only available from 2007 onwards, hasn't moved at all from 2007 to 2017. So this is about world exports and world manufacturing, but only manufacturing. Then I want to come to this. This is where the part about how the rest of the world is working. And what you find is that the Indian trade share as a percent of world trade has constantly gone up. More to the point, and I wasn't able to do this, let's look at this one. The blue line is goods and services, constant 2010 dollars, as per the World Bank. And right now is a time period when we are at the highest level. Okay? More to the point, I wasn't able to present, more to the point, let's look at what's happened to our trade shares compared to other countries in the world. Between 2000 and 2007, and I'm only looking at Asian countries and Latin America. So I'm taking out sub-Saharan Africa, I'm taking about communist Russia, etc., and I'm taking out the advanced countries. Only those. And I'm looking at the change in our shares in world trade, world exports, sorry. Change in our export shares, world shares. The highest improvement between 2000 and 2007 was India at 0.8 percentage points. Slightly behind India was Korea at 0.8 percentage points. That's 2000 to 2007. And the rest of the world is around 0, and obviously some are negative. Now let's look at from 2007 to 2016. This is the time period when we did disastrously. Which is a country that has the highest increase in trade shares? Korea, again at 0.8. Which is a country which has the second highest increase in trade shares in this sample of all countries. Mind you, I took out countries with less than 5 million population. I think we'll all agree that that may not. I don't know what results you get. Maybe you get similar results, but I just didn't think. India was second at 0.7. What about the great country, Vietnam, which has done so well? 0.5. What about Mexico? 0.3. Chile, minus 0.1, and so on and so on. So my point being, 2007 to 2017, our share of exports in world exports has been the second highest. And we think that this has declined because of price elasticities. I don't buy that. And I don't think the data substantially supports that. Now, if you are looking for what has caused this, I would suggest look at this table. It has the exports to GDP share in 2016 for various countries. It has a change in export share for 2007 to 2016. And the last column is from the World Bank Ease of Doing Business tables. And what it shows is the taxation level. In other words, how much of the profits are retained by the firm after payment of taxes and wages. Vietnam does very, very well. You know, they've taken over the textile world, etc. Their share is 61. Korea, 67. Bangladesh, 66. India at 45. Now, if you were to have a 10% depreciation, right? I mean, we'll go from 45 to 50. What a 2 percentage point change in export tax, overall taxes, corporate taxes, etc., will bring about a much, much larger change. So looking at the tail, which also is like a Cocker Spaniel's tail, is not even there, to drive Indian exports and using that as an explanation is, I think, somewhat questionable. Look at taxation. That explains. Now, what are the big takeaways? And I'll be done. Small sample size yields dangerous results. RER movements behave perversely. Decline in export shares, not much of an indicator of export performance between 2007 and 2016. Most of investment share decline explained by lower increases in investment deflator relative to the overall. India's share in world exports is today at its peak at 2.6% versus 1.8%. And share of exports in own GDP at 19.1% in 2016 was 20.4% in 2007. We have one of the lowest declines. You want to look at declines? Look at China. 34 percentage points decline between 2007 and 2016 in nominal export shares. Looking for explanation of bad export performance in all the wrong places, only 45%, which I just mentioned, in India. I want to present 2 more slides. You want to look at what determines growth, okay? This thing is very simple. This was done as part of the great demonetization exercise, which people keep repeating, has done this, that, and whatever. I'm looking at very simply what happened to growth in India. The demonetization effect is defined as GDP minus mining, minus manufacturing, minus public administration and defense. The manufacturing is taken out because of the whole problem of something called the twin balance sheet problem. And you find this data goes all the way back to 1980, and this is the real interest rate as defined by the SPI lending rate, which has problems, and deflated by the CPI. So if you're looking for growth, look at real interest rates. You're looking for exports performance, look at taxation. Last slide, and unfortunately Shanta is not here, it keeps coming up about how inequality in India has really gone up. This is all the way from 1983 all the way to 2011-12, which is the last bit of data that we have. There has been hardly any change in consumption inequality in India between 1983 and 2011-12. Let us await for the 2017-18 data to come out before we start making, and which may show that inequality in India has really gone up. I do not know. But neither does Shanta know, nor does the World Bank know what that data will reveal. Until then, let us keep our comments about Indian inequality shooting up at a bare minimum, if not zero. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bhalla. I think some very useful points. The problems with quarterly data and all the seasonality issues that go with it, the limitations that exchange rates have as an explanatory variable. Exchange rates, as we know, are endogenously determined, and often movements in exchange rates are corrective movements to set right some unbalance. Some factors affecting competitiveness elsewhere are compensated and corrected and balanced by exchange rate movements. So to that extent, the explanatory power of exchange rate has to be seen carefully. And of course, some very useful pointers from the econometric point of view to enhance the robustness of the study. So my thanks to Professor Bhalla. Let me now request Professor Kletzer to make his comments.
Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit differently than Surjit about this. I'm going to talk a little less about the subject and more about the paper, and with more interest maybe in the editing of the paper, where we go from here, as well as the topic. I'd first like to say that it's a really nice paper. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm, at least interest in the subject here. One of the things that I particularly liked about the presentation was it reveals the rapidity with which Sajjid and Toshi can revise the paper. There's quite a bit more material in the presentation than in the draft that you have, and very nice material, some of which I'm actually going to repeat. Let me go a little bit to what motivates this paper, right back to the very beginning. But part of it's really kind of important because of what Surjit just discussed, is that we did see a real boom in 03-08, and the two periods that I've written down here are the ones that are really concentrated on the paper. Those facts are just in the paper, and you've heard them over and over again. The important thing is maybe one to think about as a context is the relationship between this paper, as mentioned, and Punagupta's presentation yesterday, which observed that there was high emerging market growth, but not only higher for India, but also that exports were performing much more as a share of that growth. That's an interesting point. The point of focus of the paper is the global export growth rate fall after the global financial crisis was reflected in a fall for India's share of global exports. But one of the things that's interesting, which is similar to something that Surjit just said, which is that you saw a small fall and a rise back to, I have a different denominator here, 2%, he had 2.5%, but pretty much exactly the identical the identical curve is on the World Bank's, can be found in the World Bank. The thing that's interesting here, and the episode that's really particularly important for some of the policy implications that are being drawn from the paper, is in terms of trade improvement and the real exchange rate appreciation that has occurred primarily in 4-year period, really from 13 or 14 on to 18, at which mirrors the real exchange appreciation that occurred during the boom period. So not only was there in this data a boom in global demand, the income effect, but there was also a contributory effect to the rising growth rates from the depreciation of the real exchange rate occurring with the rising oil prices. So that's part of the theme of the paper. One thing I want to note is that the first part of the paper shows that the fall of growth, the rate of GDP, happens to equal the decrease in the growth rate of the value added of exports between the 03-08 period and the 2012-17 period. I might want to argue that export growth does not explain that decrease. What I really mean isn't that I disagree with Sajjid's emphasis on the importance of the boom in export growth during the boom years before the GFC, but rather that you are doing a partial accounting exercise here, and even if you did a complete accounting exercise as Poonam did, you wouldn't be able to infer that kind of causality. In terms of sort of a journalistic sense, though, or more an intuitive sense, or maybe a policymaker's sense, I think I do want to comment, and that's a little bit prissy because we do observe that the rapid growth in exports during the boom years may have been leading India's growth. It'd just be nice to do that in a more systematic way to make that case, or at least to write it more accurately. Between the periods, right, one of the other things you might notice is that imports aren't mentioned in the paper. Imports aren't constant. Net exports rose in between 2012 and 17. That actually you could pick up in Poonam's paper in one of the graphs. And so that means that there is an increase in net exports that's occurring in here. It's also contributing then to, of course, GDP. Investment fell significantly, and Sajjid linked that to the fall in export growth. I'd like to see a little bit more about that relationship, what's going on in the export sector, but I'll get to that. That's not a macro question. Okay, so one of the things we both see is that investment in imports begin to rise, but export growth remains slow. You might have noticed in his graphs that what you're really seeing in that post-period is you see that slowdown in both investment and exports and a significant rise in consumption. So I think it's important to think about the accounting differently. But as I said, prissy. Okay, the empirical analysis, I have a different take on the empirical analysis than Surjit. The first is that it is nice to get a longer time series so that in fact, the amount of data is multiplied by quarterly data. I do think it makes sense to look at quarterly data here, but that's, on balance. I like the way that this was done. In particular, I think that the methodology makes sense, and I think Sajjid made a good case for it. It is the way that most people would consider this, is that the best that we can estimate are long-run elasticities. We try to maximize the amount of data we have, and perhaps one of the problems is breaking it into the sub-periods is the amount of data. What's interesting is that the variation of the elasticities across export groups, I think that's provocative, and it's interesting. It's sort of working in a direction that I think interests a lot of people. I'd like to know a little bit more about that, and I'll go on to sort of how we'd like to understand that a little bit better, and not necessarily the elasticities themselves. One of the things that the estimates, the export elasticity show, is that exports are fairly responsive to real exchange rate movements. That was emphasized a lot. I think that one of the things that's gained in this paper over the cited papers is that you get not only the additional data, but there's a lot more variation in relative prices. There's a lot more variation in global income that's going on in that period. So he's actually getting quite a bit more movement to estimate against. So I will move on. One of the things is I want to think about how they interpret the slowdown. The interpretation wasn't emphasized in the presentation, but it is emphasized in the paper. At least it really stands out to you. One of the things that we would look is that if you look at just eyeball the data, not even run a regression, is since 2000, India's real exchange rate and the price of oil are closely related. And that's a motivating thing in a lot of the discussion in the paper, is that there is a falling price of oil in recent years. The falling price was huge, right? It's a 40% drop. The falling price in oil was coincident with, of course, a terms of trade improvement in India, and that was, by reasons linked in general equilibrium, to the real exchange rate movement. You also see that the real exchange rates steadily depreciated before the GFC, in fact, in particular in the period from 2000 onward, 2003 onward, as oil prices rose sharply to 2008. Then, of course, we know they suddenly dropped. You may recall they also rose again suddenly after the crisis. So one of the things that we really can't tell in looking at this is that we can't tell if there's a regime change, not a double regime change, but versus that there might be a response that's asymmetric. What I really mean here is that Sajjid put up, and when he added into this, which is new in the presentation, the value added in exports, he talked about the integration with global supply chains and the decrease in domestic value added in exporting as possibly one of the reasons why we see that sensitivity. What I'm interested in is the sensitivity between the two time periods, but there are really only two time periods, and in one of those time periods, there's a steady depreciation, in the other period, a steady appreciation. So I think it's important to maybe look at that, to look in that and inside those periods, or look for more data. That's one of the reasons to look at cross-country at panel regressions, but it's not here. The argument in the paper is that this is post-crisis, post-2012, is that the oil price decline is similar to a capital inflow. That is India is paying less for oil, that it in fact is realizing the equivalent of an inflow of capital and an improvement in the current account deficit, and that's an important part of the story here. Because in fact what they're doing is telling a story in the paper where the terms of trade improvement, okay, is leading to, just like a capital inflow, leading to an expansion in demand. The expansion in demand means an increase in production of non-tradable goods. In equilibrium, that means a real appreciation. And the real appreciation can lead to a decrease in the production of tradable goods. So even though you got a terms of trade improvement, you don't just get a decrease in import substitution production and an expansion in export production, you get a contraction in export production because you get a contraction of the tradable goods sector. And that's, of course, we also see some corroboration of that story, in the real exchange rate. As the real exchange rate rises in this paper, you also notice that the non-oil gold current account surplus falls, consistent with the Dutch disease story. So as I note, fine, okay, but we need to know whether the production of non-tradable goods actually did increase relative to the production of tradable goods. And what I don't see in the paper, and I'm a little suspicious of, is we didn't see a reduction in the production of tradable goods necessarily, and that rise. There is some possibility for it, and I hadn't really thought about it writing up the slides, but in watching the presentation, you do have that rise in consumption share, which might in fact validate the Dutch disease story. The question is it really a helpful story? But you may in fact be able to validate it that way. That leads to sort of the questions of what the importance is of that story. And in the presentation, very little was said. Sajjid said very little about monetary policy implications. But in the paper that you have, it's a highlight of the policy implications of this. So what the regressions do suggest is that real exchange rate movements significantly affect export growth, net exports as well, by the way. The observation that falling oil prices have parallel effects to capital inflows and real exchange rates suggests that the RBI ought to intervene in foreign exchange markets, or perhaps ought to have, accumulating reserves. Okay? And there's some tentative comments that were also made here about that what we might observe is resistance to exchange rate nominal depreciation. But that actually shouldn't have necessarily happened in an inflation targeting regime that in fact targets domestic inflation. So the first past open economy, new Keynesian models, of course, point this out. Okay? It's modified if you have incomplete exchange rate pass-through, but quantitatively those things may not be terribly important. It is certainly modified if you can manipulate your terms of trade. Okay. So models in which you can manipulate the terms of trade, you will indeed not want to target domestic inflation, and you will want to, in fact, influence the nominal exchange rate and hence the real exchange rate, or really the terms of trade. That's sort of different here. So I'm sort of thinking that what they're really saying is that maybe, in fact, attention to the exchange rate is not what you ought to be paying much. If you are in an episode like this and in an inflation targeting regime. There's some substance for that, but I would worry about making a rash statement without thinking carefully about credibility. But it is a good question, and I think they're right that monetary policy, that traditional foreign exchange market intervention and the accumulation of reserves would not have conflicted with the inflation target. You already have an easing of inflation that allows you to lower the inflation objective. The other one is to understand a little bit more, and this is my primary comment, to understand a little bit more about what's going on in export industries. And I'm a little more, I noticed that at the end of the presentation that Sajjid and Toshi had talked about, began talking about using microdata and thinking about that further. But it's really more that question of understanding the slowdown. Do I understand the slowdown from the macro data? What I observe is a real exchange appreciation and a slowdown in global demand. Global demand is exogenous. The appreciation may or may not have been due to a resistance to allow nominal depreciation. Again, I'm really quite ambivalent about that. What might be much more interesting is to try to understand the consequences of the relative price movements in terms of trade movements, and global demand cycles for exporters. And firm level data might be able to help us do that. In fact, it should, and it has been used even in the case of China. The contraction in global growth after the GFC, subsequent recovery of global demand, and the real appreciation may in fact have affected firm level exports at both the extensive and the intensive margins. And it may be the extensive margin, and where we think that it's most important is that there's a slowdown, in fact, in entry into the export industries, and entrance into exporting are more productive firms, and entry into exporting raises productivity growth. So both of those things are probably really important. It's also at the bottom of thinking about the Dutch disease story. Because if a concern in episodes of real appreciation is that the temporary reduction in industry growth, right, this is really manufacturing growth in the case of the Netherlands in the old days, has persistent effects on productivity growth, that by having less investment, you get less learning by doing, you don't get those kinds of scale economies. So the primary mechanism for the impact on productivity growth in the new import industries, right, is likely to be declining entry and exporting. And that's a guess. Okay, just guessing that what you're seeing is you're seeing slower growth in exports, you may be seeing slower entry in exports. Another hypothesis, which also might be enlightened by looking at microdata, was made in the presentation, which is that there's a move towards greater integration in global supply chains, which is reducing domestic value added in exporting. But both of those are things that we could get a hold of maybe much better at looking at micro data, and we can't at all even talk about them with macro data. So that's what I would really like to see is that if we're going to talk about what's happening why there is an export slowdown, is that export slowdown some permanent phenomenon? Was the big boom just a matter of the global boom? Maybe what we really want to do is a microeconomic study, look much more closely at what's happening in those firms, and I'm particularly concerned, and repeating myself, about what's happening at the extrinsic margin, what's happening in the export industries. The macro analysis, right, indicates the slowdown is concentrated in certain industries. Pharmaceuticals are one, engineering is another, services less so. You can't tell us why. And that's interesting. I would like to go beyond that in that we know that there may in fact be a lot of competitive pressures in pharmaceuticals facing India, particularly from China. And they may also be occurring in some of the engineering industries, and the capital goods industries. That might be the reason that you see the price sensitivity that's going on in here. The price sensitivity in pharmaceuticals could suggest that maybe it is a particularly competitive industry, there's a lot of entry. A related question I didn't notice is that I might also like to know if FDI has responded to this, but that's again on the question of just sort of thinking more about firm entry and exit. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Kletzer, for your very insightful comments and for driving down into the key elements of the paper and offering some deeper insights and some opportunities for follow-up work, I guess. So I think we are slightly behind time, but I guess the lunch break is there as a cushion to make up a bit. Let me quickly open the floor for very pointed, precise questions or very pointed, precise comments. If you could just, indicate your name and speak into the mic. Thank you. So.
Yeah, I'll try and make my comments as brief as possible because so this is an excellent paper, really good paper, which also accords with my intuition that the responsiveness of exports to the exchange rate is high. However, I think that what you have estimated, you call it the price elasticity, but actually it's not. It's the exchange rate elasticity of exports. Now, the problem with a single equation model, so I have two comments. One is econometric, the other is more substantive. On the econometric side, the problem with the single equation model is that it mixes up demand and supply response. What you really need, and I think that if you had a different model, it would strengthen your results, which is a simultaneous equation model where you have a demand equation for exports and a supply equation for exports. So you can estimate a price elasticity of exports, a foreign price elasticity of exports, and a home supply elasticity of exports. Now, just to be self-referential for a minute, I estimated a model precisely of this kind with Ian Little in my book on India in 1994. It's a very long time ago, but we estimated this simultaneous equation model for the period 1960 to 1990, and we found a high price elasticity of demand for exports. So my guess is that if you did that, you would also find the same. The second point, the econometric point, is to the extent possible, you could try and repeat this exercise with a different concept of the real exchange rate, which is the price of tradables to non-tradables, if you can construct such a series, which would then accord better with the second half of your paper. Okay, so that's my econometric comment. The policy comment is that your policy remark really is that policy has no role, basically, that the real exchange rate appreciation is something to be accepted because it is an equilibrium appreciation, and you will now say, quite rightly, you should not resist a real exchange rate depreciation. Now, whether the real exchange rate appreciation should have just happened without the policymakers trying to do something about it is a controversial question, which you do not go into. Now, there is a debate on this in India. On the one side are people like Shankar, who is sitting next to me, myself, Arvind Subramaniam. On the other side are people like Rajan, probably Urjit Patel, and some others. So there is so people on my side would say it is not, people on my side would say the lag between exchange rates and exports is long and variable, so you need a competitive real exchange rate to be in place for some time before you can have an export response. Therefore, the objective of the authorities should have been to keep the real exchange rate reasonably stable in this period when it appreciated very rapidly. Now, could you have done that? Well, the argument on my side would be you could have done that with the traditional mixture of sterilized intervention and targeted capital controls, which of course would say that India has gone too far in the direction of liberalizing capital controls. But I don't want to go into this because this is a big debate, but I think that your policy, the policy side of your paper does really need some, a coherent, I mean, if you believe what you say, you need a coherent argument as to why the alternative would not have been a good idea. So that's my comment on that. Now, I don't want to comment on Surjit's commentary because there is so much in it that, it requires critical requires scrutiny before one can comment on it. I will say one or two things which stood out to me. One was some facts. I mean, he said that the real exchange rate of India appreciated by 10% between 2000 and something and 2007. Well, actually, if you look at it, the figures say that all that appreciation took place in 2007. So most of the time, the real exchange rate was steady. There was a blip in 2007, and it then went back again. So that was a period when the real exchange rate was being kept fairly stable, as it was from 1991 to 2004, when it was reasonably stable. So that's just a fact. The other thing that Surjit said was that you should correct the real exchange rate by productivity changes. Now, this is a big topic. I don't think the Bhalla-Samuelson story applies at all in the case of India, for various reasons which I have given in my L.K. Jha memorial lecture. But I leave that aside. Productivity adjusted real exchange rate is difficult to understand because, of course, the productivity change and the real exchange rate are interrelated. So what the hell are you measuring? So I'll leave it at that. But I think that Surjit's comments require a lot of thought, and which it's impossible to give in such a short time. But I think this is an excellent paper, and I congratulate you.
So would you like to quickly respond, or we can just take the question?
Sorry.
The person sitting at the back, I guess.
I'm Renu Kohli. Very nice paper, Sajjid, and much required, I think, in the current policy discourse. There's a lot of debate about this. I have a number of comments. Well, in the beginning, I mean, the dynamics of the current account will start at 2000, but if you go back, then you will see that India's current account dynamics has always been the same. There is a steady expansion, then there is a shock. Before the 90s or mid-90s, the shocks were induced by oil prices or rising imports and the fiscal dynamics. Subsequently, you will find capital shocks account shocks have added to it, and the frequencies increase. So, the dynamics of the current account is actually, for the last 30 to 40 years, I would say, is expansion, depreciation, correction, reversal, but never the depreciation or the correction is enough to restore the current account, to its what you would call a fundamental balance. Second is the resource allocation effects of exchange rate appreciation. Ken has touched very finely upon that, and in that context, I just want to refer that there are some anecdotal studies which are coming about in recent times over the entry and exit of firms, and I draw attention to particularly study on the MSMEs by the Tamil Nadu State Department, which was tabled in the Tamil Nadu Government Assembly last month, which talks about how many MSMEs have shut down, close to about 49,000, and with job losses in lakhs, and those are effects induced by taxation. Now, GST is one such thing. I mean, these are real resource allocation effects that taxation changes. Many businesses become unviable, and the size of the tradable sector in that context is something that can be looked at. Third is the stability of coefficients is an issue, and as you see, as you show that in the last 6 years, you find a substantial reduction in the size of the coefficient. You attribute that to deglobalization, but there's also, of course, as you talked about in your presentation, the endogenous impact of additional permanent, fresh import demand which is created because of such a policy of appreciation, and then that gets embedded into a permanent import demand, and that has again effect upon real resource allocations. So in that context, the tradable and the non-tradable prices, which is the internal appreciation, that's a very valid remark Mr. Toshi also made. And some years ago, we did, we did an internal exchange rate calculation, Sudeep Mahapatra and myself, and we did this. We basically used the prices from the WPI and constructed a series, and we found a long-run appreciation in the internal. And anecdotally, you can see it in the rise in the price of services. for close over 2 decades relative to that in manufacturers. So that is a real appreciation. I would say that you don't get any result on your coefficient.
Please keep the comments very brief, I would request you.
Yes, just I'm about to end. Two more points. One is this stall project. Perhaps you may want to extend the results of Volodymyr's regression of 2050. If you use electricity, those are indicators quite easily available. So, you could pin down the exchange rate impact even more firmly in the last 6 years. And last of all, about regime changes and policy choices. This has been commented on earlier, the inflation targeting impact. Now, the exchange rate is too important a variable in any emerging market country, which is an inflation targeter, to be left alone. It's a half a tool, I would say, if not one. And Stan Fisher argued many years ago in the context of inflation targeting choices for EMs that it is something which cannot be just looked at. So if you look at the pattern of intervention of the Reserve Bank of India from 2014 to now, in the last 4 years, there's a distinct change in the pattern of intervention. Prior to that, there was a bias, it was one-sided, and it was basically, a lot more purchases. In the last 4 years, there is an aversion to depreciation, a lot more sales, the intensity and the frequency of interventions has increased. So, that tells you something about the regime effects and, having an exchange rate that is more aligned or consistent with achieving a certain inflation target.
The other person sitting at the back, then first.
Hi, I'm Prerna from NCAER. This paper was quite a good read. So I have two clarificatory questions. First is that now that this model has established positive income elasticity, then I was just wondering why the sign for the global financial crisis is actually opposite to what we would expect. So is it because of the way the dummy is defined, or would probably using more years after the crisis actually happened would actually help capturing the impact of global financial crisis on exports, which we generally would expect would be adverse? And second would be related to the supply shocks. In the analysis for out-of-sample forecasting that you have done, postulates that there will be a possible impact of demonetization on the reduction in exports and the export growth. So would it be possible to capture this impact in the model in itself, because the years and the quarters captured actually captures demonetization and the quarters after that? So would it be possible to per se capture this demonetization effect in the model itself?
So I think one more question, then we can request the panelists to respond and then take some more. So the gentleman here.
Yeah, Sudipta Mandal. Sajjid, that was a very impressive piece of work, very impressed by it. Surjit has tried to cast a number of doubts, but especially where I'm sitting, I couldn't even read his, his graphs and so on. So as Vijay said, we have to think a lot about what he said before judging what was that. But just two small clarifications. One is that the question of your saying that, the exports completely explain the growth story, the initial rise and the subsequent decline and so on. Yesterday, when discussing Poonam's paper, we had also flagged investment, and you have said that it is entirely endogenous, in the sense the investment behavior itself is explained by exports. So I had a little question about that, and I think Ken also sort of flagged it, because, given the Indian story of crowding in, especially with public investment and so on, particularly in that period of high growth from 2003-4 onwards, 4-5 years, and the post-GFC decline, would be useful to look at that a little more closely. The other question I had, and this is not really in your paper directly, though Avinash yesterday raised it in his talk, is about, this is looking forward, about embedment in value chains. You do make the point that there are these new exports which are now taking over pharmaceuticals, engineering goods, and services. Now, pharmaceuticals, presumably a lot of it are final goods and less the question of embedment in value chain is less important. I don't know, it's a question in my mind. Services, I guess, are already embedded. A lot of our service exports are already part of value chains. So that leaves engineering, a lot of it is OEM manufacturers, especially automobile and so on. So this is a judgment question. What is your view on what is likely to, what's the outlook going forward? You said that we must look for more for internal drivers of growth, which relates to the earlier point I made. If you have to look for internal, then public expenditure policy becomes very important.
So let me take two quick questions and then request Sajjid to respond. Professor Chadda.
Again, a very interesting paper and a lot of work done. I'm being very precise, and my first observation, as was said, that a single equation work that you have done, I'm not saying that do general equilibrium, but a little bit of general equilibrium thought to what you have done. My first observation is on the Dutch disease analogy that you have brought in. I wonder that there are other competing countries who also got benefited from oil price bonanza. So do we give some thought to, before saying something about India, that other countries would also, you see, the Netherlands was just one country. Here there are multiple other competitors who would have similarly got affected, and is there any thought given to that or any way that it can be captured? My second comment is on the domestic factors. I was not quite satisfied with just stalled projects. There may be multiple other things which you mentioned at the end, but multiple other things that are happening. I can go to suggest even, exports do not originate. It is as if they are originating from India. They are originating from different states. So a little more thought on state level analysis, that which states are more efficiently allocated as far as resources are concerned, particularly the factors of production, where the things are being produced. So I give you a new concept rather than global value chains. India should now, with GST, think about domestic supply chains or domestic value chains where the production is crisscrossing across various states. My last point, since you have given policy implications of which you have not actually done in your equations, but don't you think that one of the major things that is going to happen is the Trump-Jinping trade wars? And given that the world is going to protectionism, and if we want to gain, should we not take the lead? They are taking the lead on trade wars. Should we not take the lead, whichever way, to move into a multilateral regime system, and at least talk about it as a policy recommendation upfront? Thank you.
No takers, I guess. So let me request Sajjid to respond and the discussants also to respond if they wish.
I'm acutely conscious that we are already in a 45-minute lunch break, so I'm going to keep this very, very brief. Thank you for the excellent comments. Thank you to Surjit and Ken for very provocative comments. A lot to think about. Surjit, I'll just respond by saying, like others, I need to look at your work more closely before commenting. Two headline comments. One is that we cannot use OLS with non-stationary variables, and therefore you're getting an insignificant and positive result, which we can replicate as well. So I just think econometrically that's not appropriate here. Number two, using annual data, good point. We will extend this using annual data. The tension is going to be, given the co-integration framework, I'll need to go back 10, 15 years to have enough data points for this co-integration to make work. And the question is, the further back you go, the more structural breaks you encounter. And then Ken's going to say, this is something in 1997, hold true in 2011. That's the tension we'll face. But we'll certainly look at using annual data. It's a very good point you made on that front. On the part about productivity, I just want to echo what Dr. Joshi said, that in theory, if I could get a unit labor cost-based RER, you should have no objection with that, because then the unit labor cost by definition is the productivity adjusted wage growth over here. We don't have that data. And therefore, in principle, you're right that the CPI-based RER could be guilty of reflecting this Balassa-Samuelson effect, where you've got higher productivity in the tradable sector, which then spills through to the non-tradable sector, to the law of one wage. These are very acute assumptions that I'm not sure hold in the case of India. I will simply say if we had much higher productivity in the tradable sector for the 4-5 years where we saw the real appreciation, then we would not have India's growth differential slowing in those years, right? That doesn't seem to pass the smell test. But I think your other suggestions are very well taken. Ken, I'll just spend 2 minutes, and then I know we're short of time. From what I took away from Ken is we need much more micro level, firm level, sectoral level sense to understand what these results mean, and I think there's no doubt about that. Prachi and I had begun this 3 years ago. We need to go much further. Just to be clear, I think maybe we were a little bit glib about the policy implications in the paper. We're not arguing that the central bank should actually change its inflation target out here. I think what I need to specify further is, following through the work of Atish Ghosh, that sterilized intervention can be a reasonably orthogonal second policy instrument. And I think what you're seeing is you've got two objectives and two reasonably orthogonal policy instruments. Let me take that to Dr. Joshi's point, which I think is very important. So, by the way, all your comments were excellent, and we will try and implement this two-equation model, which I myself would be more comfortable with. Just a minute on the policy implications here. I think it's important to realize that the larger question, which is, could policy authorities have done anything different in that real appreciation episode? Just what actually happened, if you look at the intervention, the fact that reserves went up from 270 billion to 450 billion was reflecting the fact that there was very aggressive sterilized intervention by the RBI to prevent at least trade-weighted nominal appreciation. So if I decompose the real appreciation of 20% into nominal and the price differentials, it's only a 9% trade-weighted nominal appreciation, reflecting their efforts to try and minimize that. But because this was an equilibrium concept, I would argue this was inevitable, if not here, through the price differentials. So that's one part. The second part is, could policymakers have done something? I would argue yes. Fiscal policy could have been countercyclical. If we believe that tighter fiscal policy militates against real appreciation, maybe the 1.4% of GDP oil windfall that the government got could have been saved. We could have had greater fiscal consolidation, and that may have militated the extent of real appreciation. But your points are well taken. There are many other clarifications which I think I will take over lunch bilaterally so that we get some time. But thank you all for very rich discussion and questions.
Thank you. Well, my thanks to the author and to the discussants and to the very intelligent audience for their questions and for building on the presentation through those questions. Let me, by way of closing remarks, give a sort of government person's perspective, the perspective of a person associated with policy. So ultimately, when it comes to a crunch, what are the instruments a policymaker has to shape the external sector, to shape exports in particular on a healthy trend? I think clearly if you sort of delve deep into the analysis, the key determinant is domestic competitiveness. That is the main instrument a policymaker has and must pursue. Competitiveness coming out of a conducive policy and regulatory environment that encourages investment, encourages entrepreneurship. Competitiveness coming from state-of-the-art, cost-effective infrastructure. All these factors, leading to a low-cost economy. Clearly, I think for various reasons, India is a high-cost, manufacturing environment for investors, and this is the main instrument that policymakers need to use and, influence. The exchange rate, the nominal exchange rate as a policy tool, much has been said about it in the context of China, for instance, in particular. But I think the capacity of the policymaker, provided the central bank is cooperating with the policymaker, the capacity to shape the exchange rate, nominal exchange rate, and through that the real exchange rate, to shape it outside the scope of the fundamentals is limited. Even the Chinese example shows that you can have a policy for some time of accumulating reserves and keeping your policy below, your exchange rate below what it would have been determined purely by the fundamentals. But then China itself realized after acquiring reserves of $3 to $4 trillion that that policy is not available in the indefinite future. And they too, I think, at some point abandoned that policy of acquiring reserves on a steady basis and keeping the exchange rate at a depreciated level below the fundamentals as a short-term measure to respond to some disequilibrium that occurs in a sort of uncharacteristic one-time manner. For instance, the oil advantage that we got and the capital flows which were coming in, which were appreciating the rupee, certainly there is a need to stabilize that sort of idiosyncratic kind of impact on the domestic environment by acquiring reserves. But as a long-term policy, I have serious doubts about the practicality of a China-type policy where you accumulate idle reserves beyond measure. And of course, then also the monetary effects of that need to be kept in mind. That itself is a challenge. And then, the exchange rate, you have to see its impact in totality. The impact in terms of driving up the rupee cost of imports. We are a highly import-dependent economy, in particular, imports of petroleum, imports of gold. So driving up the rupee cost of imports, that effect of the exchange rate, of a depreciated exchange rate, has to be kept in mind. For BOP stability, we are an economy highly dependent on capital flows, and that too, portfolio flows in particular. The impact of, that expectation of a depreciating rupee as a policy measure, the impact of that in terms of the speculation it will cause, in terms of the uncertainty and volatility it will cause on capital flows, that too needs to be kept in mind. And I think the RBI has been guided by that on many occasions. When, contrary to the popular belief that RBI should work towards depreciation of the rupee, they've kept it steady, partly to, prevent any sort of instability on the capital flows. So I think I'll conclude with that, and let me say that I've learned a lot, and I hope it'll come in useful in these very difficult times. So my thanks to the organizers once again, to all of you. Thank you so much.